There's kind of an unwritten rule about elder selection, and it goes something like this. The elders put out the word that there's a need for new elders. The elders ask the congregation for feedback, for names, recommendations. The elders ask the congregation to pray for the selection of new elders, and then the elders gather together for whatever length of time. They pray about it. They do the best they can. They hear names of people who people recommend. Maybe they listen to for the same name a couple times in a row, whatever the case may be. Now, it's really not often a very transparent process. People really don't know how the discussions go behind closed doors. Some of that's warranted because these are personal matters. You can't just air people's dirty laundry as to why they didn't get selected, but there's often not a lot of transparency. But there is a biblical precedent for how we select elders, and I think it makes an awful lot of sense for us to go to the scriptures, not just for the criteria of selecting elders. The way the elders are actually selected, there are actually scriptural examples of that we can go to and look at, and it would do a world of good if we would do that. The final decision on elder selection almost inevitably goes back to the very elders who sit in that role. And that leads to a few things. That can lead to the perpetuation of some very unhealthy cultures. Because if you're in the position of authority, which we see that as rather than a servant role, which is unfortunate, then you're really going to look to find people who fit your culture. If you're like a maintenance culture, a don't rock the boat culture, you're not going to look for a visionary. You're not going to look for someone who's going to try to innovate into new areas or try new things or get people like moving in a certain direction. It's going to force you to face into challenges and things you may not be ready for. So it's really an unfortunate thing when the leaders select the leaders, when the elders select their own replacements, when the elders select that because they end up often perpetuating the very culture that may not be the best for the future of the church. And when elders select elders, even with congregational input, there's really very little to no accountability in that process. And that's really unfortunate. The elder role has really gone as a position that has no accountability, and it's really not healthy for anyone to have power without accountability. But if the eldership is going to ask for the congregation to pray for the future of the church and pray for the selection process, then there needs to be transparency in the process, and there needs to be an understanding of what the elders are going to do when they receive those names and the seriousness that they're taking with God's direction of people through the prayerful discernment process of the congregation, what they're going to do with those names. Because when you self-select your own replacements, you select people who are a lot like you. You select people who you believe to be successful. You select people who will maintain the culture that you've created. You select people who will not challenge the way things have been. And that's exactly what you're going to get. You're not going to get vision. You're not going to get moving in any kind of direction. You're not going to get much more conviction than you already have because you're just trying to maintain things for how they've always been. And when we go into this with a business mindset, which is my second problem, that we go into this with a business mindset rather than a spiritual mindset, then we end up with business type things. We don't end up with spiritual things. And then we undermine the efforts of the church and we lack spiritual discernment because we're going about this through business metrics and metrics of successful business people rather than successful kingdom people. Successful kingdom people know how to build relationships. Successful kingdom people know how to find unity. Successful kingdom people know how to bring reconciliation to broken relationships. These are the things that elders need to be able to do, not just balance a checkbook or follow the finances or get the building done. And a successful business person does not mean that they're successful in their spiritual life. Even someone who raised children in faith does not mean that they're successful in their spiritual life. And so the third problem is really actually the largest problem, because if we would address this, we could address everything else. And that is our model for actual selection is not very biblical. In Acts 14:23, Paul and Barnabas have gone on the first missionary journey. They go into these different areas, and then they go to Antioch, and they kind of go back through these areas. And here's what it says in 14:23. It says, Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for them in every church, and with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had put their trust. They found people who trusted God. They fasted and prayed over them, and they installed them as elders. Paul and Barnabas installed them as elders. Of course, you could say, well, they didn't have any elders to install elders, but it wasn't the local people who selected the elders. And I'm not looking for like denominational structure and things like that. I'm just saying that there is no biblical mandate or precedent that elders select elders. Zero. In Titus chapter 1, verse 5, Paul tells Titus that he wants Titus to select elders and place them in every town. Okay? And the very next section of verses after Titus 1:5 is 6 through 9, that are the qualifications. So like when it comes time to appoint elders, it's like we got to preach on the qualifications. But it's like, what about the verse right before that says that Titus is to appoint the elders? Like, we don't pay any attention to the examples in Scripture of who appointed elders. What was their process like? Well, they did it with fasting and prayer. Have you ever, and if you have, I really want to hear from you in the comments, have you ever been a part of a church that appointed elders through fasting and prayer? Secondly, have you ever been a part of a church that selected elders not by the elders, but got other spiritually minded people who could help ensure that unhealthy leadership cultures did not perpetuate, but had spiritually minded people invested and involved in a prayerful, fasting, spiritual discernment process to come to a convicted conclusion of who God was selecting, not who people were selecting. So Paul and Barnabas select elders, Titus select elders, I imagine Timothy selects elders. It's like these other people are selecting elders. And it gets tricky because we don't really have the apostolic role today in like an overarching sense of the itinerant apostle that they had at that point in time. So I get that it's not apples to apples, it's apples to oranges. But I think we at least need to be leery of people who are in positions of authority with zero accountability, selecting their own replacements in a non-transparent process. Now, when you are waiting for God's guidance, it may actually happen where God doesn't give you any names, where people come back and say, we weren't really convicted about this process. Nothing's coming back. If you really believe God is guiding the process, God's informing the process, then it's entirely possible that God doesn't have an answer when you want an answer. Often elderships are looking for an odd number of people. So they're like, well, we want one person or two people or three people. It's like, well, God may be sending you no people. God may be sending you 5 people. Like, don't put a number on that. Prayerful discernment does not ensure that God is going to give you a number of people that fits the number of your perceived need. And in all of this, when the process is not transparent, when people are asked for input and not really given a voice that anyone can clearly discern was listened to, then buy-in is not created. Trust is not created. In generations past, people would follow people through positional authority, like that person has a title and a role, so I'm going to follow them out of respect to that title and role. That's not the case anymore. People are going to follow people. People are going to follow leaders who they trust, the voices that they know. Just as Jesus said, he's the good shepherd in the Gospel of John. We need good shepherds among the people. Those are called elders. They're called pastors. They are people who really love and form relationships and connections with the congregation, with the church body. And so in all of this, we've just made a royal misstep by only considering the qualifications, which are character criteria and demographic criteria of the people who are eligible for the selection process, without assessing the selection process. And again, as we talked about in a previous video, without talking about the actual role and is this person suited for the role, because God's not going to convict you of someone who's not suited for the role. Consider term limits. Consider it a time of re-up, and the reason I say that is a couple-fold. One is that it allows the congregation to reaffirm people. Is God continuing to call you to this role? Rather than allowing or placing the burden of that decision on the elder themselves, it allows the congregation to have some say in those who lead them. Like just term limits on eldership just gives people a graceful way out. And I think that's really a kind thing to do, not a biblical thing to do, but a kind thing to do, a kind thing to consider. And you may pray over all the elders and re-up all of them, but the sheep will follow the people whose voice they know. And if the sheep find that there are certain people who they're not following because of distrust, because of things that have been said and done, because of mismanagement, because of poor leadership, then there needs to be a way that this is not a perpetual role. There's no verse in Scripture that says it's perpetual. There's no verse in Scripture that says it's limited. So I believe that God has left it up to us to make that decision. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed, now's the time to do it. And we will catch you in the next video. Here's a couple for you to watch in the meantime, and we'll see you soon.